In the Battle of Revenge, thousands of fighter planes took off from 13 aircraft carriers and rushed toward the positions of the volunteers like flies. After multiple rounds of overturning, hundreds of tanks, thousands of cannons, and 250,000 infantrymen using female tactics specifically aimed at volunteers pushed forward hand in hand. This kind of stable and sweeping formation of thousands of troops, I am afraid that few troops can compete with it. Not to mention the volunteers who had been fighting continuously for many days and were almost out of ammunition and food. However, what they never dreamed of was that this seemingly seamless attack was found by the experienced Boss Peng. With one move, Tian Ji raced horses to counter and annihilate 78,000 enemies and performed a miracle of sticking to the defense and counterattacking. So how did Boss Peng find Li Qiwei's omissions in the 100 Secrets? What kind of extraordinary command skills has been shown in the deployment of troops? Let us take a look at the fourth battle on the Korean battlefield today. How did the volunteers fight the peak battle where the weak defeated the strong and the few defeated the many? After we mentioned the two major shortcomings of Li Qiwei's discovery of the army, all the forces of the United Nations Army were gathered, with the South Han River as the boundary, the main attack on the west front, and the auxiliary push on the east front. At this time, the 6 armies of the Volunteer Army are still resting, which shows how passive the beginning of the fourth battle is for the Volunteer Army. On January 27, the day after Ridgway launched Operation Thunderbolt, the headquarters of the Volunteer Army ordered to stop the rest and switch to defensive operations. But in the face of Li Qiwei's problem, how to solve it? There are 3 solutions. The first is the most imposing, and what Li Qiwei is most willing to see, is to concentrate his strength. A head-to-head contest with the elite of the US military on the Western Front. Obviously, it is almost impossible to repel them with the current equipment of the volunteers. At best, it is a tug of war. Coupled with its shortcomings such as weak supplies and weak firepower, it might be counter-outflanked by the Southern Army on the Eastern Front, which is undoubtedly a bad idea. The second is that the Volunteer Army, like the United Nations Army, spreads the board and fights against the enemy across the board. In addition to this plan, the volunteers will face large-scale rapid marches, their supply lines will be more scattered, and the battlefield environment will become more difficult. At the same time, it is almost impossible to defend the United Nations Army's well-prepared push across the board. It is almost impossible to fight and retreat and fight a large-scale protracted tug-of-war. Faced with Li Qiwei's steady female tactics, Boss Peng, who has experienced many battles, also fell into deep thought. After several days of thinking and observation, he found a tactic from a river that surprised Westerners. Tian Ji's horse racing is a coup. So how does this horse race? It is obvious that the Nam Han River divides the United Nations Army into 2 parts, and Ridgway also divides their front into 2 ranks from here. The high-grade horses on the Western Front and the low-grade horses on the Eastern Front only need to block the high-grade horses on the Western Front, release the low-grade horses on the Eastern Front, and then move the main force of the Western Front to the front without anyone noticing. On the Eastern Front, after directly eating several divisions of the Southern Army on the Eastern Front, they then fought back to the Western Front from the flanks. When Boss Peng finished talking about his strategic ideas, all the frowns in the war room were relaxed. But here comes a new question: where to fight on the Eastern Front? Mr. Peng thought of Hangchang and Li Pingli, because this is the starting point for entering the northern mountainous area, which is relatively difficult to master, and the strategic location is also very important. Especially in Dipingli in the middle, it is just in the middle of the entire front. As long as it is occupied, it is tantamount to cutting off the connection between the east and the west. But it would take a week for all the troops to move to the Eastern Front, and it would take 2 or 3 days to fight 2 more battles, and it would take at least 10 days to add up. During these 10 days, what will happen to the main force of the US military on the Western Front? Who will top it? At that time, someone proposed to use 2 aces, the 38th Army, and the 39th Army came. But Mr. Peng rejected it. If these 2 trump cards were taken away from the army, especially the 39th Army, which was rushing forward, the entire Eastern Front would lose the advantage of quick battles, so only the 38th Army would remain. And there can only be one teacher left. However, Boss Peng, the main force of the blockade, handed him over to an unremarkable and even a little despised uprising army, the 50 Army. So what kind of army is the 50 Army, and can it take on heavy responsibilities? With only 20 kilometers left to reach Seoul, what kind of crazy counterattack did Li Qiwei carry out to achieve the strategic goal of winning Seoul in 3 days?